It's time to huddle up. I'm Garrett Seawright. This is the Daily Huddle for Wednesday, September 6th. Thanks for making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. We certainly appreciate it. If you're watching on YouTube, give us a hit on that subscribe button. Give the video a thumbs up. It helps get in front of more college football fans, and that's always a good thing. If you're watching, listening on the podcast, go ahead and give us a 5-star review, and we'll read them here on the show. Generally, just as a rule of thumb, I don't like when retired coaches hit you with the old, I don't like the way, and this isn't necessarily college football or college basketball or anything. I don't like the way the game is played now. I don't like any back in my day type of conversation, whether it's sports, whether it's, an older person that, that things used to be better. Just because I despise the idea of like things are changing and that means they think that they're bad. Different is not bad. Different is not worse. Different is different, and that's okay. So just as a general rule of thumb, I don't like people who are resistant to change because there's nothing wrong with change inherently. It's just different, and different doesn't mean bad or worse. So I preface this conversation with that just as a rule of thumb, if there is well, back in my day, it ain't for me. But former Washington and Boise State head coach Chris Petersen gave an interview recently to John Canizano and John Wilner about name, image, and likeness. And Chris Petersen got out of college football coaching right as NIL really was in its infancy and was going to start growing. And he got out, and he didn't get out. You remember a few years ago when Roy Williams, when a couple of college basketball coaches, kind of prominent college basketball coaches, stepped aside and were like, I don't like the way the game's going. I don't want to have to give up many of my money to recruits. And that wasn't necessarily how they said it, but that's what they said. And Chris Petersen didn't exit because I don't like the way college football is going. It was pretty much strictly I need to recharge my batteries because I have really, really depleted and drained myself. And that's admirable to admit that you can't give your all to the job that you need to give your all for. I get it. But he gave this interview and basically kind of torpedoed NIL, and not the idea of NIL, not the idea of players being able to capitalize on that, but just how drastic the rule change was, and has become. And I think he's right. I think he's actually 100% right about the 180-degree turn that the NCAA took on NIL. So this was the statement that he gave, and I guess not statement as much as the comments that he made, was basically he said, the system never made a lick of sense. But what's crazy to me is how quickly we went from that system to the one we have now. Coaches can spend all day raising money for someone else to pay a guy to go to their program, and you see that happening. And one of the things that Chris Petersen pointed to was, and I assume he's telling the truth here, is that he said that when he was at Boise State, they had a player who liked to crochet. And he said, liked to crochet of all things. So it would maybe appear that as if Chris Petersen wasn't on board with his player crocheting, but nonetheless said they had a player that liked to crochet, and he was making sock hats in Boise State colors, and that the player had said, hey, I would really like to make these hats, sell them, donate the money to charity. And Chris Petersen thought that was admirable, but the NCAA told him they couldn't. That the NCAA said that would be against our rules because basically people would be buying those hats because you, a player on the team, were making them, and that would be an improper benefit. So sorry, but we can't allow that. Contrast that with the now you can make pretty much any money you'd like as a college football player as long as there's some sort of advertising benefit to whoever's giving you the money. And that was his greater point, was the system has always sucked. And I think he might be right there, that the system was always trash. But to then turn it into this ridiculous charade, basically, where and I don't know what the pathway to right sizing this is, what the scenario is to make this a little better and easier than it was. Like, there was I think a spirit of NIL that the NCAA got on board with after, I don't know, 60 years of being in the wrong. And then what it turned into, like, the spirit of NIL was, if Subway wants to pay Caleb Williams, who won the Heisman Trophy, $100,000 to appear in some commercials, then Caleb Williams should be allowed to do that. But what it became was, some rich oil tycoon is just going to pay every offensive lineman to come to Texas A&M. So I don't know what the proper channel is to turn that into, hey, what the spirit of the rule was. And believe me, I'm not against anybody getting any cash. I guess capitalism, baby. The amount of people and the number of people and the number of congressmen who are like, we've got to limit how much these college kids make. I was like, well, wait a second. I thought y'all were like staunch capitalists, but that's a different discussion for a different day. I have no problem with dudes getting a bag. It just was what the spirit of the rule and what the spirit of the idea was morphed into. If, God bless, T. Boone Pickens was still alive, he'd just be cutting $50,000 checks for every wide receiver at Oklahoma State. I was like, well, I don't love that. But I also didn't love the system we had before, that we had to pretend that, like, Eric Dickerson got a 79 gold Trans Am just out of the blue, and it definitely wasn't paid for by any booster or anything. That was a worse system. And I think that's sort of Chris Peterson's point here, is that, hey, the system has always sucked, but this that was an attempt to fix the old system especially sucks. And his greater point, if I can put words in Chris Peterson's mouth, was that the system is designed to keep the power and the money into the hands of the NCAA, the schools, and the adults in the room, whether it be the athletic directors, coaches, etc. And that system sucks. That you've got these kids who are making billions of dollars for these universities, and their return is, we can drop you at pretty much any moment and end your chance to get that free education that we promised you. And I think that sucks. And I think Chris Peterson thinks that sucks. And I think that's okay. I appreciate that, because there's really no middle ground on this discussion. You have a guy like Jim Harbaugh, who is championing, there we go, championing the players getting paid while facing, and I don't know how, I mentioned this at the time, I don't know how much of that was the NCAA doesn't want this, and by God, we're locked in a stalemate, so I'm just going to stick it to them where I can. As much as I think Jim Harbaugh probably truly believes that his players should get a cut of the hundreds of millions of dollars that his university brings in. And then you've got, on the flip side of that spectrum, Dabo Swinney basically saying, if my players start getting paid, I'm going to quit. I'll let you figure out how I feel about that. But there is no middle ground. There's nobody straddling the fence on the idea of players getting paid or not. There is no like, well, I see the upside, and it could be really detrimental to the schools. It's been an unfair system. I think Chris Peterson is attempting to point out that it's an unfair system and that we should do something about it, but we're going about it the wrong way. And so I appreciate those comments because I think he's right. I think that you go from one extreme to the other is not great for college sports as a whole. So it wasn't well, back in my day, the way we did things was better. It wasn't that. It was simply the old system sucks. And you know what? This new one does too, because you have coaches courting rich, kind of shady boosters because they need money to get kids to come to their school. Now, I will die on this hill that simply because one school might have more NIL money to give than another doesn't necessarily mean that school is a growing power. It is definitely going to be a national championship contender because I liken it to Major League Baseball. If just simply having the most money won you championships, the Dodgers, Mets, and Yankees would win the World Series every year, and they don't. They have accounted for, 2 World Series in the last 15 years? So you're still going to have things that matter like chemistry and fit and attitude and culture and all of those things that go into winning a national championship rather than just, well, they bought the best players. There's more to it than that. But the old system sucked, and in Chris Peterson's eyes, and I think he's right, the new system stinks too. So I applaud him for pointing out, rather than just simply, this is different, therefore it's bad. He basically said, why do you have coaches who are courting these rich guys looking for money when the schools are bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars because the schools don't want to give up those hundreds of millions of dollars? And I get it. I'm certain if I was in higher academia and I was looking at those numbers coming in, I sure as hell would probably be fighting to not give the players their cut of the money also. But I'm not. So I'm going to sit here and tell you that the players deserve their cut of the money. So good on Chris Peterson for making that statement of this situation sucks. The system sucks. Can we do better? Yeah. So why aren't we? And that's an answer that I don't think many people are ready to confront yet. And that stinks as well. Also, today, I want to talk about the Associated Press poll. The top 5 in order: Georgia and Michigan, 1 and 2, stayed in the same places. Alabama jumped from number 4 to number 3. Florida State is now number 4 after jumping up from being number 8. And Ohio State dropped from number 3 to number 5. I used to hate preseason college football polls. And frankly, I hated the polls came out before like mid-October. You should play 5 or 6 games before the polls came out. Was always my line of thinking. My old radio partner he harps on this every year. And I was in agreement with him for a really long time of the preseason polls should be abolished by everybody. It should be against college football rules for there to be preseason polls. And I was in agreement with him, but I had my mind changed recently on this. And it was one incredibly simple statement that challenged my thinking. And I thought, oh, you know what? Actually, I get it. If you didn't rank anybody until mid-October, how different would the poll be from what it is from a group that did rank the preseason poll? So if the coaches poll didn't come out until week 7 of the college football season, but the Associated Press poll came out in the preseason, how different are those polls when the first coaches poll comes out? Not very, right? There wouldn't be much difference in those polls. So what does it matter at the end of the day? And I think that's the right thinking, because does the result of the poll change due to the preseason ranking? I don't think so. By generally week 6 or 7 or whatever, things have worked themselves out to where you're going to get the same result no matter what your preseason ranking was. Because if Georgia had lost 2 games by mid-October, are they still going to be number one in the poll that just came out for the first time in mid-October? No. So is there bias there? Yes, it's undeniable. And to pretend like there's not a bias would be disingenuous. But the result of the poll is not likely changed by whether you ranked this team that high in the preseason or whatnot. And we sort of talked about it yesterday with Clemson, where they come into the season with the benefit of the doubt that, well, because they've got a white tiger paw on the side of their helmet, therefore they might be a little bit better, or they're a little higher ranked than what they should be. And then because they're a championship program and have been in the past, they get that benefit of the doubt when you lose that first game, that like you might be ranked number 3 in the country and you lose early in the season. Well, that just drops you to number 9 instead of maybe Clemson is the 23rd best team in the country. They get that benefit of the doubt. So is there bias there? Yes, absolutely. But if the poll is representative of what you see on the field, then it doesn't hurt to rank them in the preseason, right? In theory, if the poll is representative of what happens on the field, there is no detriment to ranking them in the preseason. The only thing that the preseason poll really determines, I think, is the fate or the perception around a coach or a program. That's the problem with the preseason poll and the damage that it does, because it doesn't place limits on teams. So, for instance, I don't know who. Well, let me look at the poll real quick and see like who is receiving votes. Like, so UCLA is receiving votes. If UCLA goes 12-0 this season, guess what? They're gonna be in the college football playoff, despite being in number 27 in the poll right now. It doesn't limit, especially the Power 5 teams, from what their finish can look like with a preseason ranking. On the flip side, LSU lost in week 1, and they dropped from number 5 in the poll to number 14 in the poll. Well, if LSU ends up going 7-5, that is where the preseason poll does its damage, is the perception coming into the season that, hey, this could be a national championship quality team. Now, make no mistake about it, I don't expect LSU to finish at 7-5, but if things just go haywire, and maybe things didn't go haywire, maybe LSU was just horribly overrated simply because of brand recognition and how they played at the end of the season last year. Maybe 7-5 is them scraping their ceiling. I don't know. But the perception would be, hey, you guys were ranked in the top 5. You were supposed to be one of the best teams in college football and be one of those teams that could win a national championship. Instead, you finished in 4th place in your own division. That is where the preseason polls do damage, because of perception and putting guys on the hot seat that just strictly, and again, this is all hyperbolic, that hypothetical, that if LSU just had some glaring holes that the pollsters didn't realize or didn't notice, or for whatever reason, that maybe they just were a team that had been overranked and overhyped, and their destiny was going 7-5, and going 7-5 was Brian Kelly doing a great job. That top 5 preseason ranking sticks with you no matter what. So there is a good and bad. There is you get the benefit of the doubt and you kind of start in the poll with a head start. But the bad is, if things go poorly for you, the questions persist of, well, what in the hell just happened? Because you were supposed to be a national championship team. You were ranked in the top 5 to start the season. What in the world happened? So that's the damage that is done by the poll. I don't think there is a Power 5 team limited by a preseason college football poll. I just don't. If you are in one of those conferences and you're one of those teams, you control your destiny when it comes to your results in the polls and in the college football playoff rankings. It's just flat out that simple. Now, if you are a group of 5 school or something like that, yes, the preseason poll can limit your finish, your perception, etc. But the downside of the poll is the flat out, if something goes poorly for you, ooh, buddy, where are you? What happens? Where are you going from there? Because everyone will remember that coming into the season, we all thought you were going to be a lot better than you were. And the people who make those polls aren't going to examine themselves and say, well, why did we think that when in reality, why did we think A when in reality it was B? Why did we think that team X was going to be really great when in reality they were not very good? They're not going to reevaluate themselves. They're going to evaluate you and the coaches and the programs and what went wrong for you. That is the danger and the damage of the AP poll. Now, there are Ohio State fans who are upset today that, Ohio State dropped from number 3 to number 5 in the poll, and that it's not fair that Michigan beat East Carolina and Alabama beat Middle Tennessee State and they move up. It's week 1. Calm down, pump the brakes. It will be okay. I realize that it's more difficult than this, but if you win all your games, you don't have anything to worry about. If Ohio State is number 5 in the poll right now, as long as you keep putting W's in the column, it doesn't matter where you're ranked at in week 1 or week 2. And it's the same thing like last year at the end of the season when Nick Saban had said, I don't think there's 4 better teams in America than Alabama. Well, Nick, you should have won all your games. If that was your biggest worry was, well, it's not fair. Life isn't fair. But if you win all your games, you don't have anything to worry about. Again, easier said than done. And I like arguing about inconsequential things on September 6th. It's fun. It's what makes college football fun, is bitching about whether Alabama deserved to move up 1 spot because they beat the brakes off of Middle Tennessee State, and whether or not Ohio State deserved to drop 2 spots because they won by 20 on the road against a conference opponent. It's fun to bicker about that stuff, but at some point, it's like, okay, your blood pressure has to be lowered because it's going to be okay. It's fun to bitch and complain and bicker and do all of those things, but then also like there's a okay, come back to reality. Let's all calm down. We'll figure it out. It'll be okay. And I think that's where I am with some college fan bases of like, okay, Alabama is not great simply because they beat the brakes off Middle Tennessee State. Ohio State is not bad just because they barely beat Indiana. Florida State might be the number 1 team in the country, and that's okay. But they're the only one who played anybody pretty decently. LSU might be the second best team in the country, but we're not going to know that for a while just because of the way the college football season is constructed. So let's all even keel it out right now. Let's get a little bit into the season. It's sort of like teams that freak out or fan bases that freak out in like April of Major League Baseball. Like, dude, we're like 10 seconds into the season. Let's take it easy and we'll figure it out. If you still stink in October, yes, let's complain. Let's have those conversations. Let's throw our fits because that's what makes this sport fun. But as week 2 approaches, let's just like hang out a little bit, get a little like take the Hawaii approach. Like, hey, man, we'll figure it out. It'll be all right. And that's where I am. And I hope we can get there together. That'll do it for today's edition of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you do so. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, give us a thumbs up. It goes a long way in helping us out. And if you're listening on the podcast, drop a 5-star review. That'll help as well. We'll catch you tomorrow right here on the Daily Huddle with Saturday Glory.